Hi, I'm Bradley Rutler, and today I'm going to talk to you about Bitcoin. First, just a bit about me. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at UW, and I work in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and most recently, cryptocurrency. These are the four questions that our discussion today will be centered around. First, what is Bitcoin? And second, how does it work? I'll give you a little bit of a primer for those who aren't familiar with it. And then we'll talk about money. What is money? And does Bitcoin have the features that money has? And then finally, is Bitcoin a good thing? So first, what is it? Bitcoin is a digital money that makes essential use of cryptography to manage and verify the issuance and transfer of bearer instruments on a distributed ledger. Quite a mouthful, so we'll take it a piece at a time. First of all, Bitcoin is digital. It resides on computers and uses the internet to work. Second, it's money. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Third, it uses cryptography. There's actually a couple different parts of the Bitcoin network that use cryptographic functions to secure the network. It verifies the issuance and transfer of bearer instruments. Bearer instruments are things like physical cash, where to possess them is just to have them, basically. So something like a check is not a bearer instrument because checks can be canceled while you're en route to depositing them. Something like a real estate deed might not count as a bearer instrument because there might be some accounting somewhere else that says that you don't have what you take yourself to have. But when the Bitcoin network says that you have some Bitcoin, that's just what it means to have Bitcoin. So in that sense, Bitcoin is a bearer instrument. And then finally, Bitcoin has a distributed ledger. So ledgers are things like, say, your parents' checkbook has a ledger at the end of it where they record all the transactions that happened. Excel spreadsheets are often ledgers of transactions. Bitcoin is different in that its ledger is distributed among hundreds, thousands, or millions of computers running the Bitcoin software and updating, checking in with each other constantly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that now when we talk about the Bitcoin network. So the Bitcoin network has three distinct roles that people play in it: miners, nodes, and users. So first, we'll go sort of backwards. The first thing we'll talk about is users. So users are people that send and receive Bitcoin transactions. So you could be a user if you've ever transacted with Bitcoin, and you just say to the network, I want to send this much Bitcoin to this address. And then you provide the password to an address that has Bitcoin, and then your transaction is sent. What happens next is that a node will receive that transaction broadcast from you, and it will check a few things. So first of all, it will check that your password is correct to the address that has some Bitcoin in it from which you want to send the transaction. Second, it will make sure that that address has enough Bitcoin in it to cover the transaction. It will also make sure that you haven't tried to spend that amount twice. So you haven't tried to overspend the amount of Bitcoin that is in the address that you've said that you want the transaction to go from. And then the nodes will send that transaction on to the miners. What the miners are doing is collecting all these transactions and publishing them in blocks. A block of transactions is 1 megabyte. So it holds a couple thousand transactions per block. And the miners are competing to publish those blocks and add them to the end of the chain of blocks that have already been published. This is where we get the term blockchain. Bitcoin was the original blockchain and still is. So in order, of course, there are lots of miners who are running the same software and who are competing to publish these transactions. This is good for the Bitcoin network because it means that no miner can mess with or falsify anything about the network. So you want competition among the miners. And to incentivize this competition, the Bitcoin network awards the new Bitcoin that are coming into the network to the miners. So right now, every time a block is published, which is roughly every 10 minutes, the winning miner gets 6.25 Bitcoin, which is about 315,000 US dollars worth of Bitcoin. So every 10 minutes, about $300,000 worth of Bitcoin is being mined. The way to determine who wins the rights to publish these transactions, which miner gets to add to the blockchain, miners are competing to solve a very resource-intensive math problem, is the right way to think about it. They use special computer hardware that's very expensive, and they use a lot of electricity to run this hardware, run the Bitcoin software on this hardware in order to solve this problem. And then when they solve the problem, they broadcast their solution along with the block of transactions that they've collected to all the nodes that are connected to them. And the update propagates throughout the network. And as soon as the answer to that problem is found and a miner finds out about it, the miner immediately starts working on the next problem. So that's how the Bitcoin network works. And these transactions are collected in blocks. And the deeper back in the blockchain a transaction is embedded, the more secure it is. Now, let's take a sharp left turn to talk about money, because we want to know whether Bitcoin is money, and in particular, whether it's good money. So what is money? Money is a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. So as a store of value, it's a way to keep your wealth in something that will not go bad. So for example, apples would be a terrible store of value. If you put all your net worth into apples, it would be worthless within a few days. The US dollar is an okay store of value, but the longer you hold on to it, the less valuable it becomes. Your grandparents or great-grandparents could buy a can of Coke for 5 cents. Today it costs you $1.25 or $1.50. So the 5 cents that could buy a Coke now buys nothing. As a medium of exchange, the dollar is great. It's divisible into pennies. It's pretty easy to carry around, so it works well. And as a unit of account, it measures how much you have. So it assigns a number to how much you have. Gold is a better store of value. It holds its value longer. It rises in price as your dollar becomes worth less. And so in that way, it can keep your wealth at roughly the same buying power as it used to be. But it's a terrible exchange. You don't want to go into McDonald's and shave off little bits of gold to pay for an ice cream cone or something. And you don't want every business to have machines that can verify that you're giving them actual gold and not something fake. And as a unit of account, it's a little tricky. You measure, I guess, in grams or pounds. So US dollar, great medium of exchange, bad store of value. Gold, great store of value, bad medium of exchange. What about Bitcoin? Well, we could be asking a couple different questions. We could be asking to what extent Bitcoin fills these money rolls. To what extent or to what extent could Bitcoin be a store of value, a unit of account, a medium of exchange? We could ask to what extent Bitcoin is actually doing those things. Or we could ask, suppose that Bitcoin could fill those money rolls. Would it be good for it to do so? The middle question is interesting insofar as we might want to know how well Bitcoin adoption is going, how many people have adopted it and are successfully transacting with it. I think the first and third questions are more interesting. Could Bitcoin be a store of value, a medium of exchange, a unit of account? Could things be eventually priced in Bitcoin? Could we pay for everything that we have with Bitcoin? I think the answer to those questions are yes, that could happen. Then the interesting question is the normative one. Should we work towards a future in which that's happening? Would it be good for Bitcoin to fill these roles? Well, here are 4 features I think about Bitcoin that are relevant. Bitcoin is private, relatively private at least. What goes on the Bitcoin network are transactions from addresses to addresses. They have no names associated with them. And so you can send Bitcoin to someone and nobody else will know that you've sent it. Bitcoin is censorship resistant. That is, there are no intermediaries that are stopping certain kinds of transactions from happening. There's nobody that can prevent you from sending Bitcoin to a certain person or to pay for a certain kind of thing. US dollars have many intermediaries, both payment networks like Visa, MasterCard, PayPal that don't allow you to buy certain kinds of things. And also they can cut off certain merchants or users from transacting with them. The Bitcoin network is not able to do that. Bitcoin is inclusive. Anyone who has an internet access and a computer that can run the software can participate in the Bitcoin network, can obtain Bitcoin, and can send it to others. So it's much easier to get some Bitcoin than it is to get a bank account. And finally, Bitcoin has a deflationary monetary policy. So as I mentioned before, every 10 minutes, 6.25 Bitcoin are added to the supply. When the Bitcoin network first started running, that number was 50. And then 4 years later, it was cut in half to 25. 4 years later, cut in half to 12 and a half. Now it's at 6.25. In 2 more years, it will be at 3.125. And it will continue to be halved until the very last Bitcoin will be issued in the year 2140. And that will be the 21 millionth Bitcoin. So there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Now this is in contrast with government-backed currencies, which can be added, the supply of them can be increased by government dictate. The government can decide how much to print, how much is necessary. We've seen this right now in 2021 with a second round of COVID stimulus checks. That money isn't coming from anywhere. It's being added to the monetary supply. That would not be possible with Bitcoin. So is a money that has those features good? Well, one way to answer that question is to look at the consequences of it. Another way is to think about what kind of money we would want if we were behind what John Rawls calls the veil of ignorance. So step back from the world and forget what place you have in it, what role you occupy. So look at the 7 billion people on Earth and try to imagine what the people in the future will be like. And then think, what kind of money would be good, would be the very best for all these people collectively. So you can't say what kind of money would be best for me because you don't know which one of them you are. You don't know if you're a king, if you're a very wealthy person, or if you're a very poor person. You just have no idea which role you occupy. And so what you would want is the most equitable, the most fair money, the money that maybe gives everyone a chance. And you might think, well, one thing I wouldn't want is for the people who are the closest to the money creation to soak up most of the money. And this is in practice what a lot of people think has happened with the US dollar. The way that new US dollars are injected into the economy, these recent stimulus checks notwithstanding, is that they're given to commercial banks. And the banks then lend them out to people, and people pay interest. So the banks are making money on money that was given to them. Now, their accounts are debited in the federal treasury as well, and so it's not quite so simple, but you might think that what you want is for the money to be sort of equally accessible to all people. And in this respect, Bitcoin maybe seems like it does pretty well. Would you want people to transact however they want with no oversight of anyone else? That depends on what kinds of oversight you think would happen, whether it would be mostly good oversight or mostly bad oversight. You might think it would be good in some countries to have some oversight because you trust them. You think that they would not allow transactions that shouldn't be allowed but allow transactions that should be. But then you might think about other countries, and you might think, well, I'm not sure that I trust them so much. Maybe we should be able to give money to political dissidents who are fighting against oppressive regimes. And it's hard to give it to them in their government-backed currency or our government-backed currency. Maybe it would be good to have a digital money that couldn't be traced to them, but that they could use to keep going in their efforts to fight against oppression. Maybe you think that it would also be good for their governments not to know how much they've gotten. So not only that they would be able to get it, but that nobody else would be able to see that they'd gotten it, that it would be private. Maybe not, but maybe this is one way of trying to answer this question of whether Bitcoin is, all things considered, a good money. You might also think about how the interplay between money and corporations and governments currently works. There's a notion of a private government from Elizabeth Anderson that talks about how much corporate control or how much control corporations have right now over people's lives, not only while they're at work, but while they're off work. And because of the fact that the government, that the companies are issuing you your salary, they have a whole lot of control over you. Just like the fact that the government issues the money in general means that the government has some control over you. So maybe you'd want a money that would not enable so much control by your employer over you. So I'm not suggesting that either of these concepts decisively settle the question of whether Bitcoin is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think thinking about them gives us some headway into trying to answer this question. And then, of course, we haven't even touched on the monetary policy, whether an inflationary or a deflationary monetary policy is, all things considered, better. But one thing you might think is that it would be good for there to be monetary competition. Rather than there just being one money, maybe many monies that have different features that then compete in the marketplace would be better. And so if there's competition to the US dollar in the form of perhaps a digital native currency like Bitcoin, that might be a good thing as well. So these are some considerations to think about when you're trying to decide where you stand on whether Bitcoin is a good thing or a bad thing. And here are some questions that you can discuss. Some of them to just make sure you understand the concept of Bitcoin, and then some to take you a little bit farther in your understanding of it. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you learned something.